Yay, great to have you, Peter. So, for any regular listeners, we love to really not talk about too much bullshit and talk about science, and also to understand what helps people. What from a mindset point of view, like as a researcher, you're very successful at what you do. So, what we want to do is discuss not only what you do and give us some insights and knowledge bombs, but also to find out what motivates you to do what you do and to be as successful as you've been in your field. So just to start off, if you can just give the listeners a bit of a background to your background, and also a bit of a professional overview, that'd be amazing.
Sure, yeah, sounds good. I did my undergrad degree in health and performance science. That was a degree based in University College Dublin. So it's I guess like there's different terms or names to these courses, but somewhere in between like a sports science degree, but it also had elements of like public health, strength and conditioning. So it's kind of that in America maybe like it's called something else. But yeah, I guess a sort of a health and performance science degree. And from there, I guess during that time, I took an interest in, strength and conditioning and in performance sciences. And I was coaching loads during that degree. I was getting experience in the course and I was interning at the high performance gym in the college. So that was working with, elite swimmers and also supporting with, hockey players, football, kind of just any athlete that I was able to support, just to get experience. And from there, I ended up getting an opportunity with Leinster Rugby based in Dublin. Started off there as an intern and then sort of evolved, I guess, within that year into a sort of a hybrid practitioner, so like a sports scientist and strength and conditioning coach. I say hybrid because you'll probably hear that quite a lot. And my approach to things is relatively balanced in terms of, you hear things like either strength and conditioning on one side or sports science on the other. You hear of data versus intuition. I'm very much sort of centered in my approach. I hopefully take things from both ends of all of the spectrums of performance. So I worked there for just over 5 years. Did my master's in research in GPS technology and then did my PhD in sports science whilst I was there. I moved to England then to work for the FA. So I worked across men's and women's football teams or soccer for anybody else outside of or in North America, basically. I have to caveat that one. And I spent a couple of seasons there, worked quite a lot around, I guess, like recovery, sleep, supporting that. We had a project that called the Other 22 Hours where we kind of focused on all of the time outside of training. So that might be of interest to kind of dive into. I then moved kind of industry, I guess, as well, and opportunity. Got an amazing opportunity with Lululemon and in Vancouver in their headquarters in the innovation team and spent a couple of years there, like really amazing company, really cool team and work streams, and kind of opened me into this new industry, but also had work with their elite athletes and ambassadors. We put on some cool events and developed some cool product in the sort of like endurance space geared towards females. And then I came back to the UK, worked in Chelsea as their sports scientist, performance coach, again, focusing around sort of like applied physiology, recovery, physical profiling, and a lot of education, I guess, towards, staff and players as well. And now I'm, consulting across a pretty wide range of things within the health and performance space. I do a lot of work with like wearable technology, embedding that into individuals' lives and performance programs, but also companies and sports organizations. So I consult with, fitness companies, certain companies, some individuals, and some professional sport organizations as well.
You've been quite a busy man.
Yeah, yeah. It's been a really interesting, year this year consulting, but full time, but also just, a couple of years. And I've loved, the experiences I've gathered across some different environments. And yeah, to me, it's been very interesting.
Absolutely fascinating. So just go back, I think what you just mentioned that I wasn't aware of about this research you did in what athletes were doing when they weren't training. Just going back to that briefly, because obviously that sounds like a quite an interesting topic for people to hear about. What was the reasoning for looking at that, and also what was the main kind of discoveries that you found by digging into that time?
Yeah, sure. I guess the main reason was, everyone I think is relatively familiar with this increase in like competition demand, or increase in game intensity and training schedules. And I say that from like a team sport setting. So think of football, basketball, even like any team sport, the level of intensity and competition is going up. The competition density is going up. TV want more matches, money paid for this, and the stress and toll that takes on players is high. Now, at the time, obviously, I was working in international football, where there were sometimes schedules that were 3 fixtures in 7 or 8 days, and so obviously that density is really high. So recovery becomes even more important than it already was at the time, or a more of a focus, I guess. But I guess also the how we saw recovery was not just the specific strategy that somebody does after a training session or match. It's not just an ice bath or a massage or whatever tactic somebody wants to use. Recovery is actually this entire spectrum of everything you do outside of training. So that's right before training and the lead up, that's after training, that's sleep overnight, that's your nutrition and routines as well. So that was, I guess, the main reason. And one of the big aspects of the project internally was to sort of change the mindset of coaches and athletes in their thinking of recovery, of this sort of holistic approach versus, okay, I'm going to do an ice bath after a session, tick off, recovery done. And that's some people still see it as that, but we've really tried to steer people away from that singular approach and think of it more holistically.
That's really interesting. I mean, just from a strength and condition insights point of view for the athletes and coaches listening, what are the key kind of things that you've discovered that the data has shown over the years, whether it be physical or psychological, that you think that people can adapt, for somebody in the gym, for example, that can implement for themselves without having access to a super scientist?
Yeah, I mean, there's some really, I say basic doesn't mean easy, but some really like simple things that we saw in data and even in the research we were exploring as well. One of those is sleep. Sleeping more just helps with overall recovery. We saw that at the elite end, we saw that right across different age groups, where athletes that were sleeping more on average typically saw a slightly faster recovery after game day, and also just improved sort of perceived recovery as well. I think well-planned training, so periodization or whatever terminology you want to use to describe that, is really important. You can't outsleep a really bad training schedule. You can't out-eat that. So, getting a good program, placing separating stressors, planning recovery or rest days or easier days to supplement the harder, more intense training. That is critical. And then I guess food and nutrition being such a important pillar of recovery, but also performance. And there's some more nuanced strategies around timing and dosages and carbs versus protein, all those things that are important, but certainly that was a huge component of recovery from exercise, but also then in supporting sleep overnight as well.
So, I mean, in terms of nutrition, I think hopefully you'd agree that generally the quality of the nutrition in today's food is not what it used to be, just through farming techniques and so on. And we're firm believers in food first in terms of getting the nutrients that you need. However, obviously, supplement, caveat, we are a supplement company, has become, that's grown. Where do you think supplements fit, and what, if any, do you think are worth people considering? What have you seen in the field, and what, if anything, do you perhaps use yourself?
Yeah, sure. We could probably talk about this for a day. There's so much to unpick, so I'll try to keep things, like I'll prioritize a few. I guess for me, like same personal approach as what I would do myself in terms of personal approach, but also what I would recommend to people or athletes or other is definitely a food first approach. I think that's hopefully fairly well established. That doesn't mean no supplements or no processed foods. That's very difficult at the moment, and particularly for very active people or athletes. And when your activity levels and intensity increase, so too does, one, your caloric need. So if you exercise, you need to match that activity level with calories. So that's the first thing. But so too does your carbohydrate requirement, probably your protein requirement as well, and also your micronutrient requirements. And because you're placing your body under increased stress. And so to match those stresses or to counteract those stressors, you need to support that with food first and nutrients, but then supplements can definitely help and definitely play a big part, I think, in probably everybody's lives at the moment, in this day and age. And there's a few reasons for that. One, like we said, the increased need if you're an active individual, but two is convenience, and that's the reality of it. For professional athletes, people don't maybe realize, but they are extremely busy, and the schedules are so full, and their need to get, supplements and nutrients in between sessions, or traveling, or in foreign locations where they're unsure of food sources. That's where supplements have a huge part. But also for an everyday person like myself, who is relatively active, but also, works a lot, is like, in between those periods, time is obviously stressed, so supplements can be a factor. And then I think the third thing, and obviously if you have any prompts you want to go down towards, the third thing is just sometimes it's really difficult to achieve a sort of a recommended or an optimal level of a nutrient or a micronutrient or a vitamin or whatever it might be from food alone, and for specific reasons. So it's not to say everything has to come from supplement, but think of like creatine. Creatine is one that I take, and I think it's gained a lot of popularity over the last 2 years. It's been around for years, but it's more so in the last 2 years. But it's actually difficult to achieve a sufficient dose from food, and you can do it from red meats and stuff. But then there's other considerations from if you're eating excessive amounts of red meat. So supplements in that sense are probably the first choice for people.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think you need to eat, if you were to do, let's say, just a modest amount of creatine a day, but even a gram, you'd have to eat a steak. So if you were kind of creatine loading, as we recommended, back in the 90s, that'd be 20 steaks a day, which, going back to your convenience point, would be slightly inconvenient and probably tip you over quite significantly on your daily calorific intake, I would have thought.
Yeah, exactly. And even things like omegas, some people generally do struggle to achieve, to eat sufficient omega levels. So, and some people don't like seafood, and some people can't eat. So there's all these other different considerations. And even things like, we're both in the UK, vitamin D is scarce at best during winter time. So, you can get some dietary forms of vitamin D as well, of course, but supplementing with that is useful. So there's some of those supplements where they're particularly pertinent in like a general health sense, but also then an athletic performance sense. And maybe a more like niche example where there's some evidence, and this isn't me recommending this to everybody, but there's some evidence with tart cherry, for example, and helping reduce muscle soreness. And that there's some decent evidence for that, and I know some nutritionists that I've worked with who have recommended that to some athletes, and we've seen some positive results using it as well. But to achieve the sufficient dosage of tart cherry from eating, well, one, it's just difficult. It's just so impractical to eat that much. And then you've got the fiber increases and all the other pieces. So that's an example where maybe a specific supplement or sort of component is much more convenient and cost effective to supplement versus the whole food source.
I think the same probably applies with beetroot as well, where obviously the nitrates in the beetroot, you'd have to eat quite a lot to be efficacious, but obviously a good beetroot-based supplement can be a more convenient and arguably more tastier way to get the benefit if you're not a beetroot fan. But I mean, again, obviously I saw you did a shout out recently. You're looking for female athletes to take part in some research you're doing. What have you seen? We do a women's only range because we identify that actually there isn't a one size fits all. And have you seen any specific indicators among the female athletes that you work with being impacted by menstruation and gender differences that have also changed your approach not only to training, but seen that data coming through with the wearables that you've used and anything else that has shown that you can't just treat men and women the same when it comes to these protocols, but actually you have to slightly change your approach, or am I on the wrong path there?
No, I've worked with male and female athletes, so I have some experience or some perspective, I guess, in sort of some differences. I think a few years ago, anyway, one of the big challenges with female athletes was there was this like fear of carbohydrate intake, and there was a lot of stuff on social media around like low carbs supporting like a lower body fat percentage, and so one of the challenges when I was working in women's football was obviously filtering some of what they're seeing online and messaging from, magazines and social media people, and sort of showing them, that one, they're professional athletes or they're elite athletes, and their main priority is performance, but also that to perform well, you need sufficient carbohydrate to fuel that performance, and it's not going to have a negative consequence on body composition. So kind of that was probably one of the biggest challenges that we had, was like under fueling. And obviously then that can lead to, like low energy availability, and then the consequences of that being like increased injury risk. And so that was probably one of the biggest like differences, I guess. And but that was also the case with some male athletes as well. It was really just trying to educate and support their energetic needs, and then kind of going from there. I think on the menstrual cycle piece, there's obviously, most of the recommendations, the evidence at the moment seem to suggest that, there's no blanket recommendations across different phases, but that doesn't mean that you can't support a female athlete managing their own individual trends over time. So I think you're going to see, and there obviously is more and more research now, you're going to see tons of research come out, and hopefully tons of hopefully practical applications for people to use as well. And, whether nutrition and supplements can support in certain aspects for individuals, probably, yeah, because if for example, for an individual female athlete that we know for the last 6 months she experiences higher muscle soreness at X phase of the cycle, as an example, well, there's some things as a practitioner or coach you can do to support that. So maybe one, you adjust training load. Okay, if if muscle soreness is a problem, then maybe you reduce some of the eccentric load from training. You make sure that she is sleeping sufficiently. But then there are probably some foods or supplements to make sure that she's eating enough protein and carbohydrate. But then also, like we just mentioned as an example, cherry extract, tart cherry extract. So there's definitely some strategies you can do, but it's definitely more on the individual level and supporting the individual, but also then measuring the impact of that with that individual as well.
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of, like you touched on the wearables there, obviously that's a big area of interest to you. Do you think, actually, I'll go back one step. You mentioned about, social media, magazines and so on. Obviously, a lot of people now are getting scientific recommendations from social media, and a lot of that is often by people who may look the part but aren't qualified to give that kind of information or even advice. How can somebody of any level kind of do a bullshit test on this, or a sniff test, whatever you want to call it? And what are the big things that you're seeing that are being put out there which are clearly wrong, which we can maybe tell people, don't listen to anybody talking about this? And if they are going to listen to people online, and there are some very, very credible people as well, how can they kind of filter out who to listen to and who not to, and put it into some kind of context, you think?
It's really hard. Firstly, so it's really hard to filter out and to understand who or what is credible and what's accurate and what's applicable. And I feel like one of the like easy filters to consider is, there's very few definitives in terms of like tactics and things. And, like I said, I consider myself a balance practitioner or scientist, and there's always different nuances and contexts and stuff. So I feel like for a lot of the big blanket statements that you see online, they probably aren't as strong as the person communicating them might think. Now the challenge is, like, there's some really, really good communicators who are pushing certain messages, and their communication skills are unbelievable. That's why they're content creators and influencers and whatever else sort of you want to look at them as. But on the other sort of end of the spectrum, there's also some really good researchers and practitioners who do some unbelievable work, but actually aren't amazing at communicating that that sort of like evidence base to the general person or population. And I think there's a good opportunity for people, again, sit in the middle of that spectrum if you can, but also for those people to collaborate and support. So that's probably something I'd like to see online a little bit more, or like people being a little bit more centered around like improving communication skills, but also then obviously leaning a little bit more on the research. And if someone sits, on this end of the spectrum, trying to work with someone who has obviously experience in certain areas and stuff, but it is really difficult because there's some very convincing messages out there that, again, you've just got to try just, I guess, investigate who the person is and what their experience is, and then kind of make some informed decisions. I would ask some people, I get a lot of messages online, but like, hey, I saw this. What do you think? And so I'll try to support people in their understanding, even if other people are sharing content. But yeah, it's tricky with how much is out there.
What's the biggest bit of misinformation you've seen, do you think, if you can name one?
Good question. I don't know if there's like one specific thing, but I do find like if the challenge with like some content creation now is that if someone has a very popular topic or video, reel, whatever it is on Instagram or TikTok, people will replicate it just because the virality of the topic. And so they'll replicate the video. I've seen people replicate the exact like script and texts and everything. And so the people replicating the message don't even know much about the topic themselves.
They're replicating.
Yeah. So that's probably, so I don't know if it's like one specific topic, but I have definitely seen that where like, I've seen people sharing the exact same video, the exact same content. And the challenge now is actually, it's not one myth, but it's like people will prompt ChatGPT or AIs the same prompts, because again, people are looking to content creators going, use these prompts to create 50 topics to talk about, and then everyone's using the same prompts, everyone's using the same content, and no one's actually really verifying or putting their own twist on it and stuff. So it kind of ends up being a bit of an echo chamber and stuff. So
yeah.
I haven't really answered your question, but that's probably the challenge more so than one specific topic or myth.
Okay. So going on to wearables, obviously there's been massive adoption of that. Personally, again, I'm probably going to be a bit of an antagonist on this. I think they've got a place, but I think people rely on them maybe too much. And sometimes some of the data, like for example, and again, maybe you're going to correct me, this is a chance for me to learn, I'm certainly a bit old, so I guess my spectrum thing is slightly different. But for example, you've slept X number of hours, of which Y is good quality sleep, and so on and so forth. I accept that is probably correct, but the point is, if you've got things that are happening which are outside of your control, which affect your sleep, knowing, if you've had a bad night's sleep. I had one last night. I know that because I feel tired, I feel a bit lethargic, etc., etc. And yes, my wearable could have told me that as well, but that's not going to give me the ability to affect tonight's sleep just because I know that. So it'd just be good to understand where you feel the wearable information can give you enough insight to actually make a practical change versus just giving you data almost for data's sake, which no matter how robust it might be, you're almost unable to make any change as a result of it.
Yeah, it's like I've like you said, I've done quite a bit of work in this space, and again, I think I sit in the middle of like using the data with your perception and subjective feel and understanding. And one of the challenges, we've put wearable technology and physiology into the hands of everybody, and overall, I think it's fantastic because it's giving people objective data and measurement of markers that are associated with better health and performance. So, for example, resting heart rate, we know that a lower resting heart rate is linked to a reduced mortality risk. And it's also sensitive to detect changes in illness and fitness, and all of like it's a pretty reliable and valid measure for a lot of different things. So I think it's great. And as part of that, people have improved certain health behaviors. So I think I can say this as a generalization. People in the world are generally drinking less alcohol. And that is partly due to one, the research that scientists are doing, showing or showcasing the negative effects, but also it is probably in part to do with wearables, it's probably in part to do with content creators who are sort of like educating people on the negative components of it, and as a generational, I guess, aspect as well. And one to go back to my point, one of the challenges with putting wearables into people's hands is that we would have never done that previously because people haven't been educated in these areas. And if you think back to when I've worked in sport and I still do some stuff with GPS technology or force plates or velocity based training, a lot of those things we used to never consider giving to an athlete and letting them interpret themselves. It was always a person or a coach who would, I guess, educate or bridge the gap between the data and the athlete. Whereas with wearables now, there's a direct source of information and data to the person. So that's a big challenge. I think the problem we have is not actually like a tech problem, or it's not a data problem, it's an interpretation problem. And that's probably the biggest challenge for us. And I say, like, myself, someone who shares some content online, is trying to overcome is to equip people with the understanding of how to properly use wearables, but also how to interpret certain metrics. And I think one of the problems people have is that they will sort of buy a wearable, they'll use it, they'll sort of become a little bit obsessed over some of the data. They'll almost interact too much with the data at the start. And then after a year, they sort of maybe lose interest and they stop wearing it. Now, the true benefit of these wearables, in my opinion, is longer term tracking of trends. And when I say longer term, I mean over months and years, not over weeks and months, or like 6 months. And so I think if you can be really consistent and use the data in ways that I would recommend on social media, that is sort of the sweet spot for it, where it's giving you objective data. And I think at times it's important because it's important that you don't overly rely or only rely on your perception, because sometimes that is not a good marker of readiness or recovery or even illness. And sometimes objective markers can deviate before symptoms arise. And so the example of that is during COVID. We saw this a lot. We still see it with respiratory illness, where certain health biomarkers from wearables, temperature, resting heart rate, breathing rate, can increase before symptoms arise. And you can use that as a sort of a way to change, I guess, the stressors, or adjust the stressors you have on a day so you don't end up in a hole you can't get out of.
Sorry, Peter. Yeah, pressed the wrong button there. But yeah, I think, thank you. I think maybe I'll be a bit more. I'll take a little bit more notice now of what I'm seeing, and try and combine that, like you said, with that real world experience. So, in terms of like holistic, I guess we've touched on that. Holistic health and well-being. What do you see, from a broader point of view, between the connection between everyday wellness and elite performance, and what things can everyday fitness enthusiasts learn from what you've done with the elite, which is them, for everybody?
Yeah, I think one of the main considerators, a few things. I think like elite athletes just tend to have quite a that's coming through, yeah. The elite athletes definitely have their schedule nailed. So their calendar is sort of controlled for them, because there are performance staff and practitioners and coaches who are trying to meticulously plan out their day and week and month. So accounting for everything in your day is something that I recommend to a lot of general population people, including myself, because if it's not, because of how busy people are now, if something's not in your calendar, it's just not going to fit into your day. And so I recommend to some people, and people might think this is obsessive, but it's just to account for the time, is block off 7 hours for sleep. You might have to move the 7 hours, but at least do it. Block off eating times, exercise time, block off like focus time, things like that. And I feel like the schedule is one of the things that elite athletes, not that they have control over, but it is controlled for them. And that's one of the things that falls by the wayside for general population and sort of the everyday athlete like myself. So that's one of the first places I would start, is just controlling or getting a hold of your calendar and your schedule, which isn't a very scientific, concept. It's just a very basic
Yeah.
one, but all of the principles apply across the board, like sleeping sufficiently, eating to match your caloric needs, eating appropriate macronutrients and micronutrients, and then training sufficiently. So the scheduling one, I just think, is a piece that kind of ties it all together, that athletes have done for them, but general population people tend not to. They tend to be a bit more reactive in trying to fit things in, or if things move or they miss something, then they don't have a sort of a mechanism to shift that time
Yeah.
around in the day.
So like that consistency thing. So actually what I did, I started moving to full body workouts, because that way I found that if I did miss the day, at least before, when I was doing like individual body parts or split or whatever, that if I missed, like instead of doing 4 days, I did 3 days, I missed something until the following week. Whereas by doing full body, if I'm not missing anything at all during the week. And I guess I'm at that age where, full body kind of works a bit better for me than doing a split. So I think 100% that consistency and being, on it in terms of prioritizing your fitness and health is really important. So yeah, thank you for that. And in terms of and you touched on it there, going from the research to the practical implications, how much of what you've seen in the lab has transitioned and translated well into practice, as opposed to stuff that kind of only works in the kind of scientific controlled environment versus stuff that works in the real world?
Yeah, I think like that's a big challenge that a lot of researchers have, is translating things from the lab to the field, is sort of how I describe it. And I feel like for the most part it's done reasonably well. There's for example, when I've worked in sport or in rugby, a valid lab measure of fitness is like a VO2 max test. But in a professional sports setting, sometimes that just isn't feasible because of time commitments, schedules, everything else. So the research that's done on it is sort of relating a field-based test to a lab-based test. And then a practitioner in the field can then use the field-based test to sort of approximate or estimate fitness based on sort of some research. So that's an example where it happens all the time that people forget. But, when you see aerobic shuttle tests in team sports, they are just, the research has been done on those to relate them to a VO2 max or an improved running economy, that type of stuff. So that happens all the time. And the same thing, I would say, with strength. Unless your sport is strength, so powerlifting or weightlifting or other kind of fitness-based sports, a measure of a squat or deadlift or bench press, they're just approximations for strength. And they're not actually, what you're trying to do is improve force. And so the sort of lab-based or like gym-based test you would do to really measure force is on a force plate. But when you use an exercise, you sort of estimate your maximum force capability. And so there's another example, I guess, of like the blend of lab-based testing and field-based testing. So I do think for the most part, things get translated pretty well in the health and performance space. But the field-based stuff is really important because it makes it accessible to everybody. And again, another example of that is on these wearables, where the sort of, I guess, gold standard considered for measuring sleep is polysomnography, PSG for short. And that requires, someone to go into a lab and get sleep measured, but that's not feasible to do every day because you can't do it. So the sort of field-based measure is these wearable devices, and they're measuring sleep. And again, there's research done that sort of validate some metrics against some of the gold standard. And that's again a way that sort of, maybe people need a bit of reminding that like the field-based things are they are being translated from the lab. And you'll see that now with wearables, even heart rate measurements were first taken in the lab, and now they're so accessible in chest straps and wearable devices and arm straps. So I think it's happening pretty well, actually.
And what do you see the future in terms of those? Do you think we're going to see more? I mean, where does AI fit into some of this? I mean, I know, for example, some people now download their wearable data, put it into ChatGPT, and ask it to interpret it. And going back to your earlier point, I think obviously ChatGPT doesn't always get it wrong because it depends where it's getting its sourcing from. But do you think that has a potential role, and where would that be, and what do you think the potential outcome or benefit of that would be?
Yeah, I think the future of a lot of this stuff is like combining all of the input streams together. So if you use a wearable or your gym program or your sleep or your calendar, like all of these different things that you do as a person need to be pulled into something. And then I do think AI will have a big part in helping interpret it, but I think the model will be on like more specifically trained AI algorithms and models versus the sort of publicly available ones. Because, like you said, those models are pulling from information all over the world, and it's not filtering for what's correct and what's not. And the prompting and the components of that go into those AI models have to be very specific. And you have to give an AI model a lot of context as well. So I do think it would be a big part of helping people manage some of the, I guess, day-to-day decisions, but then also some of the longer term behaviors. And will also definitely help with analyzing some of the data to help people understand different trends and patterns and things as well. So will be a huge part, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. It just has to get a little bit better in terms of like accuracy. But there's some really, really
Yeah.
good stuff out there at the moment.
And do you think DNA and epigenetics is going to be part of that, or?
Yeah, like you've definitely seen a lot more, like I guess even like blood testing and I guess looking under the hood that companies are integrating. And you'll see that in wearable companies. So you've seen, I mean, Aura have embedded a continuous glucose monitor in their sort of ecosystem. So Ultrahuman Whoop have now you can upload bloods reports from external providers into their platform. And so again, I think that's part of that step I was discussing around like integrating all the different input streams is like if you can get a holistic picture of your health across all these different measurements, then yeah, you're going to have a better picture to paint than if you just look at one metric in isolation.
All right, brilliant. And then in terms of the biggest myths that you've seen in performance, always good to have a bit of myth busting. What do you think those have been that you've experienced, and maybe even things that at some point you were convinced this is right, and then later on you've gone, actually,
Mm.
that wasn't the case.
Yeah, the myths is always interesting because I know they're like really they're good like sound bites and stuff. I guess like just I just don't like if anyone is claiming something that's feels too good to be true, it probably is. So like if
Yeah.
you're seeing some of those things out there or snippets, like this some of those things probably are. There's probably some downstream effects as well. But I think the biggest thing people struggle is like um context. And what I mean by that, like someone will see an exercise online and they'll say, oh, like, okay, this athlete's doing this exercise, like I have to do that exercise. But the because are you at the same strength level or training age as that person? Do you have the same goals as that person? Like, does it fit in
Mm.
with all the other things you're doing? So I don't know if I have any like if you shout a few myths out to me, I can maybe dispel some of them. But I
I
don't
don't know. I
off the
mean,
top of
I
my
see some
head,
of these
like
things where you've got people just doing, looks like exercises that are just created for the sake of creating content, which look innately dangerous.
hmm.
Or they're trying to get something I read the other day, and they're trying to make out I mean, I don't think it's a big deal to do 1,000 press ups in a day. I think that's very doable for somebody who's reasonably fit and healthy to not necessarily do it in one hit, but to do it over the course of a day. But I'd be interested, that one particularly just jumps to mind because somebody asked me, is that doable? And I'm like, yeah, I guess it probably is. But then you see people like hanging with things hanging from them and elastic bands everywhere and doing that kind of stuff. What's your kind of thoughts on those kind of things?
Yeah, so on some of the extreme like exercise variations, I just think like 90% of people just don't need a lot of them. And if you're seeing that from elite level athletes or coaches, it's probably, you have to adjust things and things need to be a little bit more specific and the stimulus has to change and evolve if you have an athlete has a really, really high training age. So if you're working with athletes who've been strength training and sprinting and exercising for 10, 12 years and their strength levels are 2.5 times body weight for a squat or at such a high level, well then the methods for them to make progress have to look like they need a different stimulus. So some of the things you see online from those, like unless you're at the strength level they're at, just you probably need to do the same exercises over and over and over again to get to that point.
Yeah.
Some of the other bands and things like that, yeah, like people probably do stuff for, views and engagement and stuff like that as well. And I think the point you touched on some of the exercise challenges, I mean, I like some of these because people are creating content and educating people on, like, you can integrate exercise into everyday life, and whether it's a push-up challenge, or you've seen some of these running challenges, like X kilometers every day, or and I like some of them, and because it encourages people to just move more, and
Yeah.
typically for most people that is the challenge of just doing more exercise. That's probably the biggest thing that I would promote for people, is like they're just not exercising enough, and they're worrying about which exercise to do and what supplement to take and all these other things. And I'm like, just do
Do
more
something.
exercise, do more
Yeah.
exercise, do whatever it is that you can do every day, and do it. And the challenge with them is obviously, again, filtering them, because the people doing those challenges, even if it's like, running ultra marathons and all these things, like they've been training for that. And so if you want to do one of those, that's fine. But like my recommendation would just be to like take your time getting there,
Mm.
because you can do some damage in some of those sort of extreme challenges and videos you see and exercises you see online. So that'd probably be my take on them. Like I think overall they're net positive because they're encouraging behavior, but they can become a little bit extreme. And as long as the messaging is constructive alongside them, I think they're good.
Brilliant. So just to sum up, what would you say to anybody wanting to improve their performance as an everyday person that they should be doing? I think you kind of said it, just do something
Mm.
consistently. But is there any particular type of exercise or thing that they should be doing to achieve that?
I think for me it's like just start with the basics and the biggest contributors to overall health and performance. And that's, like I said, yeah, exercising more. So a mix of muscle strengthening and sort of cardiovascular aerobic based training. Two would be make sure you're sleeping sufficiently and eating well. And if you do those three things consistently over the next 2 years, I can pretty much guarantee you that will have the biggest effect on your health or performance, health and performance for both. Now, there's obviously some things if you can remove or reduce alcohol intake, hopefully, smoking or vaping, that type of stuff. If you remove those, I can pretty much guarantee you that you'll have some big changes and improvements in health and performance. Then, after you have established 2 years or at least a year of those really good habits, we'll then start to look at things that can help, you know, strategies, specific tactics, timing of eating, supplements, that kind of thing. Now, the one caveat I will say is sometimes the smaller things can help unlock the bigger ones.
Bigger, yeah,
And
yeah.
so that I do say that because, let's use sleep as an example. One of the things we know is, okay, sleep consistency and going to bed at the same time is important. Now, if you start with the routine, that's obviously the best recommendation. But sometimes, oh, sorry, if you start with the consistency, that's obviously the biggest driver. But sometimes for some people, the smaller habits and strategies or tactics help unlock the larger consistency. And so, you can talk to, depending on who it is or their context, it might be, okay, here's a supplement and I want you to do some breath work or journaling. Now, they're smaller movers, but they might help someone go to bed at a consistent time, which that actually then helps them sleep more consistently and sleep better. So I do acknowledge that in this world, there are definitely some needs for the behavioral consideration is a huge factor. It's something that we spent a lot of time on when I worked in football as well, around like when we didn't see athletes all the time, we had to try influence their behavior very powerfully or impactfully as
Mm.
well. So it's definitely a big consideration.
Brilliant. So if people want to find out more about you and they want to get up to date with you, where's the best place for them to go to find that, Peter?
Best place is probably Instagram at the moment. I am on like LinkedIn, I post a bit on as well, and I'm trying to sort of expand the different ways that I share content as well. So I am going to start doing a little bit more on like Substack. I do a little bit on like a YouTube as well in the new year. So, but Instagram's probably the best place, or LinkedIn, and then I can direct from there.
Brilliant. Listen, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for your time, and you know, good knowledge bombs, and hopefully I'll have you back on again soon to discuss things further, because I think there's a lot
Yeah,
we could talk about.
definitely. Yeah, good to chat.
Cheers, Peter.